So, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. As usual, I'm your host, Tamara, and with me today is Thomas Searsback Helen Yu. And I'm really hoping I got that pronunciation right.
Pretty good.
But Thomas is the founder and CEO of CostBits, and he's here to tell us and talk about the role of procurement and finance and how we can all work better together. So, welcome, Thomas. Lovely to have you on the show, and thank you for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure. We're looking forward to it.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Thomas, and what's your background?
Well, so my initial background was actually out of being in sales and marketing completely. I did that for a good 8 years, but it wasn't been in IT. So when the bubble burst back in 2001, me and everybody else was scrambling for real jobs because everybody thought that IT was just a fad. Thank God it wasn't, but it didn't feel too good for a couple of years. Because I'd done all the commercial stuff, I wanted to be able to move into the other side of the table. And being a sales guy, the obvious part was to move into procurement. And then I think somebody in my network had called me up and say, "You're looking for something else. There's an opening at Maersk, the shipping line. You should give them a call." So I gave him a call, and the poor girl in reception, she had no clue what I was asking about. But eventually I kind of winded myself into like operational purchasing and then procurement. When I started in procurement, believe it or not, back in 2003, we were 3 people in procurement. And then I think 4 years later, we were like, a couple of hundred at least. So it's a massive journey. And you learn a lot of stuff when you start in a department that really doesn't exist when you get there. And one of the critical things that I definitely learned was that finance was our best friend, but potentially also our biggest foe. Because if we didn't agree with finance, nothing worked. If we did agree with finance, we could actually do really good projects. We also discovered that we didn't agree on a whole lot of stuff because we're coming from 2 very different worlds. So I kind of made it our thing. Also, in what we do now, what I've done in my career, to make sure we span that gap, to make sure that we communicate more and we actually get aligned about the same targets, the same ways of measuring success, basically. So I did that for a long time, and then I've done turnarounds. I just left PwC as a partner a year and a half ago, and now we're doing this setup.
Exciting. And what do we mean by ensure, like you talked about alignment and, finance and procurement being strategic aligned. What does that mean?
Well, I think in some organizations, I'll say if you look at where procurement is anchored, it kind of typically goes into 2 different organizational anchor points. Either it goes to finance, which is typical in, for instance, Maersk, really big organizations tends to be there. But if you go to production companies, typically procurement is part of more of an operational setup within like a chief operations officer instead. So there's a different anchor point. But I've always worked in an organization where procurement was anchored within finance. And it's interesting that finance and procurement will join to set the targets. How much money do we want to reduce? How many suppliers we want to get rid of? Or what do we need for maybe a growth spree that we're looking into? But then we meet 6 months later, and then nobody's agreeing on the numbers anymore because finance has very much an accounting perspective on how it looks, and procurement has no clue about accounting because all they care about is where they can buy this and how they measure it. So you start off on a good path, and then quite rapidly, people tend to disagree about baselines, performance measures. Finance asks the completely fair questions: where's my bottom line impact? And procurement is elaborately trying to explain the fact that it will be there, but it will be there in 3 years because you need to use the contracts first. And maybe not all of it, but some of it. So there's just so many things that can go wrong. So I think it needs to be a focus point to make sure that there's more dialogue and there's more alignment, and that the numbers they're looking at actually reflects both the finance side, but also the procurement side of it. So,
and what are some of the things that need to be in place for a healthy procurement and finance relationship?
Well, I think it's kind of like, assuming that we belong in the same organization, I think you need a fixed governance, just very basic. Make sure that whoever is heading up procurement is completely aligned on a minimum a monthly or much more repetitive basis with finance, but also that when they have these discussions, that they all agree on the numbers. So inherently, procurement may not seem like finance, but it's very much finance anchored in how we work. All we really care about is how much money are we spending, what are we buying, what kind of pricing we're going to get going forward, what kind of terms and conditions, and where can we buy it from. So most of what we work on is actually financial data. So we make sure that the same insights that finance has is the same insights and same approach, same perspectives that procurement has, which is rarely the case. Right? Typically, we end up with finance and procurement on separate sides of the table instead of being on the same side of the table with the same numbers.
And what are some of the signs that you are on separate sides of the table? If you were going into a procurement department and looking into it, what are some of the things you might see if that's the case?
Well, I think if we come in late, I've seen this a couple of times when I was still doing advisory, we would typically see that I would be dealing with, so I would normally be connecting with CFOs because I was in PwC, right? So very much an audit company. And we would discuss with finance and we were asking about how's procurement supply chain doing. More often than not, they would come back and say, okay, well, it's doing okay, but we can't get the numbers to fit. Like, so really, really fundamental stuff, right? It's not about personalities, but just that the numbers just basically doesn't fit. And then we need to get people around the same side of the table, and we need procurement to explain how they're looking at the world. We need finance to explain, what's their perspective on this and why it doesn't align. So typically it's because finance is just disagreeing with the numbers that procurement come up with. Procurement also, unfortunately, seems to be not always understanding that finance is looking at bottom line. We're looking at trends. We're looking at what did we have last year, what are we going to have this year, what are we going to have according to budget. Where procurement, when they look at it, they look at last year, a bit of forecasting, and then they make a contract for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And then over time, they'll realize these savings, but they're not really monitoring it. So procurement has a tendency of doing a contract, hopefully communicating it, hopefully also making sure it gets implemented, and then leaving it for the actual cost owners, which is never procurement unless it's indirect spend. They're helping. Procurement is a service organization, right? So they're doing this on behalf of somebody else in the organization, which is not finance, which is not procurement, and they leave it to them to use the contracts and report on performance and impact, that kind of stuff. So procurement really gets disconnected from the live data feeds, which is what finance is looking for, right? So there's a few things that just tends to go wrong every single time.
And I guess that's a big gap in procurement, actually, because if they're not understanding the outward impact of the deals and the contracts they're making, that has serious implications for how well they're negotiating the deals in the first place.
Yeah, so I think they understand it when they, well, I think they firmly understand this when they negotiate it. I think what is missing is the ongoing monitoring of it. I think everybody spends a lot of time on creating a good baseline that both finance, the cost owners, and procurement agree on, but then procurement leaves it, and the day-to-day management of that cost is done by a cost owner, somebody else, and then connected into finance, and then procurement comes back once in a while and kind of pokes it and say, oh, by the way, we think we realized some money, but they're not really engaged in the day-to-day tracking, which they should be, right? That should be part of the task. So if you do a big contract, something complicated, you really should get involved with finance on making sure the numbers, they fit every single month.
So obviously there's an absolute business case for aligning the two, but how do we do it better? What are some of the improvements that people need to think about to make sure that they're both singing from the same hymn sheet?
I think you can do a few simple things. First of all, make sure the governance works. Make sure there's like repetitive interactions, so you're forced to actually look at the same numbers. I think we definitely need to make sure that the tools that people use from like a data analytics, a spend management, a compliance follow-up are the same tools. You'd be surprised how many times we've done assessment with clients where we come out and we look at the procurement tool, which looks all nice and neat, and then we look at the finance tool, which is also very nice and neat, except it's not the same data sources. Right? They're not aligned. They don't really fit. So unless we make sure that we all feed off the same insights, it's bound to go wrong at some point. And this is not a big, complicated thing to fix. It's quite easy, actually. It seems to not get done because procurement uses data in a different way that finance does.
Yeah, I'm a massive believer in aligning data sets. And in fact, I think I've got a talk coming up on that because that's one of the biggest challenges I find that that's where a lot of miscommunication happens in business if you're all looking at different numbers and also interpreting those numbers slightly differently.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting that, in all these alignment meetings, even let's just say they have a good governance structure, instead of spending, maybe 1 hour a week or month or whatever the schedule is, focusing on what works, what doesn't work, how should we prioritize, resource allocation, strategy directions. It seems to be, 59 minutes is spent on aligning on the numbers and agreeing to disagree, and then 1 minute on panicking, and I'll see you next month. Right? That's not really conductive for anybody. But I've seen enough of those meetings for it not to just be a one-off war story.
No, and I think it's the same with sales and finance as well. The amount of
Yes,
conversations I've been in when the sales
totally.
team are looking at one set of numbers and going, "We've hit our number," and finance are looking at a different one, going, "No, it doesn't quite add up." So
Yeah,
yeah.
doesn't add up. Yeah, no, same thing. I have to say, right? And then imagine what happens when you start doing forecasting. You get all three of these in the same room, right? You got finance who really want to get the numbers to work. You got sales who really want to sell, but they also know they're going to lose some. They got a bit optimistic, and then you get procurement, who is always somewhat pessimistic about the market and what sales actually does. And you have three people guessing about the numbers. So no wonder forecasting never really works when it comes to it, right? It
No,
doesn't help.
and I actually had a cracking podcast, and if anyone hasn't yet listened to it, on dynamic budgeting, and almost like a different approach to budgeting, which I think is definitely needed. And this kind of conception that a forecast as well needs to be perfect is one of the piece. It needs to be realistic but not perfect. I
Yeah,
think is always the
exactly
challenge.
that. Absolutely.
So
And I think we also have to be honest that forecast is just a perspective of the world based on what you know right now, which could change in 2 minutes, right? So if you're not dynamic about it, it doesn't work. And again, most of my adult career grew up in a very big multinational company, right? We would do like 1 year forecasting. And when you left the room, you say, okay, wow, that's going to be amazing. And then like the day after, you're like, everybody forgot about the forecast and they're just doing the best they can. It never really got adjusted because it was also too cumbersome. But the process behind it was just too lengthy, and too many people had to get involved, have opinion about these numbers, instead of being a bit more fluent. Not saying you shouldn't forecast; of course you should forecast. It just needs a different way, and I think a bit more simplicity for
I think agility is something we underestimate the value of in finance, right? Because finance historically has been asked for perfection. The numbers need to be right
it.
down to the penny. It needs to balance on both sides. Everything needs to be perfect. And actually, a lot of the conversations we're having now is about how perfection is not the aim unless we're going into an audit, right? Actually, it's so much
Exactly.
more valuable to the business to serve information that is, say, 99% right and forget about the 0.01 penny you can't find, and serve that faster and
Yes.
within days rather than waiting 6 weeks for perfection. And I think the same is true across all sorts of areas, forecasting as well, is that we need to think more agile and less perfection.
Yes. No, I absolutely. I mean, coming from an auditor, I can only second that, right? I mean, we do not. When I was in B2C, we would not audit forecast, right? We were auditing the books at some point, quarterly, half yearly, or at the end of the day, right? But we were not exactly looking at forecasts. So I think it goes for finance in general, maybe just to be a bit more, I think, not loose. That's probably a very wrong term to use within finance, but at least maybe not be as strict about the precision of forecasting savings as they're being realized, but make sure that once in a while there's a really good stamp saying, okay, now at this point it has to be correct, and then we move on. We take 2 months, and then it has to be correct again, right? Be more agile as we go along, because that's how the business works. And I think if we do that, then hopefully finance will also free up more time to actually support the business, because I think there's a lot of knowledge hidden within finance that basically doesn't get shared. I mean, finance knows the numbers, they know the trends, they know the cash flows, and what we have and what we don't have, which is valuable information, but often sales and procurement, for instance, they don't really see it. It's very much a one-way street into finance. We need something back to also just help us improve.
Yeah, and you made an interesting comment there, and I think something just to pull out is it's not just about the production, it's also about the learnings of that information. Because I think that's again
Mm.
something that's missing in the loop around forecasting specifically, but also in a lot of other areas. Data is the why. So, okay, the forecast was wrong. Let's look at it. Let's figure out why we forecasted wrong initially, and how do we fix that problem so next time we forecast it's that a couple of degrees more accurate, or we're closer to reality, more closer to reality.
Absolutely.
So talking on the topic, so you mentioned obviously a couple of things that finance and procurement should be looking at to be more strategically aligned. You mentioned governance. We talked about aligning data sets and reporting and data sources. Is there anything else that comes under that governance banner that should be part of either the
Yeah.
processes or the way we approach it?
Well, I think there's one thing that people tend to forget is that we need to make sure we also have like basic stuff like KPI alignments. I know it's sort of old fashioned, and some companies are even like removing these for whatever reason from the dashboard, right? But I spent a lot of time on working with organizations saying, right, what are your actual KPIs? When we then did an assessment, like typically either we were doing a turnaround or a merger acquisition for these organizations, we'll look at it, and then the KPI structures in finance was sometimes partly reflected within procurement, but not at all within sales, and it didn't even exist within production, which had very different KPIs, right? There's something said also about making sure that you actually measure, because if you measure and you report in, that's also what you get. So making sure that this is also formalized. So if you have high-level targets, make sure at least some of them, not all of them, because every functional department is slightly different, right? But that some of them actually scrolls down, they stack up, because then everybody knows that you have to report on these. At least those numbers need to be correct every single month, because if not, you're not on your KPI target. Doesn't have to be all of it, but just make sure it gets aligned right. And again, it's pretty banal, but it doesn't happen. So when management sits and they make the KPIs, they all agree. When it goes to the first level organization, they tend to agree. And it gets really scattered, and nobody's really has the ability to restack them and make them fit at the end of the day.
So ensuring that your procurement KPIs align at the lower end or aligned with finance's KPIs is a key.
Yeah, and with sales, right? Yeah, and I mean, if you work in an organization where you have a big, cost of goods sold element, you also want to make sure those KPIs, actually those procurement KPIs are aligned with sales, and sales KPIs are aligned with procurement and with finance. Because if not, they're going to go in different directions. And they all hate it, by the way. Sales hate to have procurement KPIs, and procurement thinks sales is the enemy. So, but that's a different topic.
That's a whole different topic for a separate podcast. And so anything else? So we talked about governance. Is there anything else that we can do to align procurement and finance better?
I think it's a good start, honestly. I think getting this right would get us quite far, right? So making sure there's good governance, the data is the same, KPIs structures are actually, fitting with each other, then I think anything after that will be a lot smaller impact than these three topics.
And what about the communication between finance and procurement, or reporting lines? Is there anything that you've learned over the years about how that should be considered?
Well, I think I'm mostly working in organizations where procurement is anchored on the finance, so it's pretty natural that we communicate that way. There's a lot of organizations where they reside under some sort of operational setup instead. They still need a financial anchoring. Personally, I'm not a big fan of dotted lines and secondary reporting flows, because I think it gets complicated. But I think no matter where procurement is residing, it does need some sort of financial anchoring, because in the end, we're working on the same numbers. And procurement's focus really should be to make sure we have goods and services the right place and time, right quality, but also that we get the right cost picture for it. So they're a huge part of managing these organizations' cost. Now, depending on some of these organizations, if I look at production companies, typically way more than half of the total cost of the company is supplier-based. So it's not a small impact that procurement has, right? But they tend to be left a bit alone and not really be part of the essential reporting here. We don't always get, the right toolbox or the right people to get it done. But it's a huge impact. I'd much rather focus on improving a few percentage in procurement, which is straight to bottom line, than focusing on improving a few percentages in sale, which is just piece of a margin, right? That may happen over time, because honestly, the procurement money is a lot faster.
Absolutely. It's a good way to look at it, actually. I've never heard somebody say it so well there. So I guess one of the things is that we're talking very much about very large organizations where they have an entire, perhaps, procurement department that's sitting alongside finance. What about sort of mid-sized organizations what can they learn from those larger organizations? Maybe they've got one person that's managing the procurement from within finance. What are some of the things we need to consider there?
Yeah, definitely. And we primarily work with mid-sized organizations by now, actually. I think there's a few things. Design-wise, we know that procurement, if it even exists in the organization, is always way too small. We also have to be realistic and just, understanding that these procurement organizations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, will never be more than that. Right? So they have to make do with what they do. So I think a key thing realizing resource, training, toolbox constraints is for finance to make sure they set the firm direction for procurement, because procurement tend to not be part of the strategic discussions, not for real. They read the PowerPoint, but they're not really part of the board, right? So procurement has to be, kind of dictated that, you have to go left or right. And within that space, also be very firm from finance saying, given that we only have maybe 1 or 2 people for this, we have these priorities, you're doing A, B, and C, but you're not doing the rest at all. Because what happens with procurement is that they can easily fill their day. Right? I think they're always trying to do the best they can, but procurement is kind of also easily becomes like a garbage can for all the stuff people want to buy, all the stuff that needs to be done, and then it kind of ends up in procurement because you want to buy something. Some people think that we buy, very simple stuff, pens and paper, and other people realize that we also buy, jumbo jets and big container terminals. But somewhere in between, people just think that procurement will buy anything on this planet, which is fair. But if you're a handful of people in it, then finance has a strict role in saying procurement will only handle these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories that are critical for supporting the strategic direction of the organization, and they will not handle the rest. And I think that's a lesson learned both for the procurement people and the understaffed department, but also very much for finance, because we normally see that finance will come in saying we manage all the costs, and now we have a procurement department, so it all has to go to us, which is not good for anybody, right? Because they simply cannot manage it. They don't have time for it. It's very basic. And it's much better to focus on what they can manage, what they can influence, and then just simply let the rest go. It's kind of back to this agility point we had before about the forecasting. I mean, it's okay to let 20, 30% of your spend just be rogue if you think you can manage, the 70, 80% really well. And that's the spend that makes sense, either because of cost or high risk or, direct influence on your strategic performance. And then the rest, you have to assume that you hire smart staff in the rest of the organization and they'll do their best. Right? So just let it be.
And how do you know, as a finance team, you're at a point where you need that procurement skill set?
Well, I think there's a tendency of seeing this a few places. We tend to either see it because the accounts payable flow at some point realizes that they get a whole load of invoices that may not match at all. So automatic three-way matching, if you don't have contracts and goods received, very, very tricky. Actually not possible. So at some point, there's going to be a whole bunch of people in the AP flow. That should be a clear indicator that you need somebody to start clearing up their act, and procurement would be the obvious choice for this. Is either there, or we see, general financial performance, typically because it's deteriorating, not because it's good, but typically because it's going bad. And then you have to look at it. And then as soon as you start scratching the surface, you tend to realize that the actual contract coverage, even just finding the contracts for these suppliers is maybe difficult. But also that the overall financial performance, the amount of suppliers just seems to be lacking. So you need to clean it up a bit. So when they have nothing, it tends to come in. Procurement tends to be originated out of a cleanup exercise. Right? It also means that you have to be careful about the profiles you get. So if you have nothing, the first couple of profiles you get tend to be kind of people like me who will go in and clean up. We are not very good at doing day-to-day procurement. Let's just be honest. At least I'm not. That's definitely not part of my skill set. I'm a cleanup guy. That's why I do turnarounds, right? So we go in and we'll clean up, and then after a couple of years, finance should definitely put somebody in place who's more of an operator. You kind of resemble it to a startup, right? So we have a startup here. We're building it up. I have one team now. I'll probably have a completely different team in 5 years. Because if I keep the same people in 5 years, they'll tear it apart because they want to build something new. Right? And the same thing goes for when you start a procurement department. Different personality profiles for when you start it and versus when you run it.
We say exactly the same when we're doing finance transformation projects. Like the team that implements, you need some level of consistency. You need people part of that journey at the beginning that are going to stay there for the long term, and they're willing to bear with the change to get to the end point. But you also need those individuals that thrive in the chaos, I would say, of actually clean up and getting things moving. And it's different skill sets, and I think it's a really important piece to recognize when you're building teams for any kind of transformational change. is having the mix of change makers and change monitors, the people that are actually going to keep that change going and make sure that the day-to-day is done.
Absolutely. I think one of the most difficult things with this is to make sure that the people who start on the team, who are like the cleanup, the builders, the entrepreneurs, somehow make it known to them that we do not expect them to actually be there in 3 years or 5 years, right? Because they will not fit. And then we have an organizational responsibility to make sure that we find somewhere else where they fit, of course, because they've hopefully done a really good job, right? So we need to make sure that we think about how do we then put them into a different role where they can actually thrive and we can still get benefit as an organization. But we also have to tell them that we don't expect to be there. I mean, I know this, but I've also been told once, to be honest. It was not the most pleasant conversation ever, but it was a good one afterwards.
Yeah, and I always think that those that thrive in that kind of change environments make really good consultants. So, you know, if anyone is in that piece,
that's what I did.
There's a lot of cracking consultants that come out of enjoying. I actually had one the other day. So somebody that had been through an implementation absolutely loved it and was almost came out the other end wanting to do another one, which was a wonderful, I think, badge of honor there. I always think that's a great if you enjoy the change process, but then you get the other side and saying, actually, I'm a little bit bored now, I want something different, then you're probably in the same category as us, and need something a bit more exciting.
Exactly.
To go with.
But that's why I went into consultancy, right? That was exactly it. I mean, I've been doing all these massive projects for these big companies. I wanted to keep on doing it, but I didn't really need to be in the same company anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I joined PwC. And that's also why we do a startup now, because we want to keep on building and keep on supporting. And then we'll do this for the next, 8-10 years and then something else.
So talking of procurement, and we talked about obviously procurement in small businesses, and we talked about the importance of finding the right team when you're putting in a new procurement department. And one of the things I've always thought is that sometimes the focus in procurement can be too much on cost versus value. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it depends on the organization. So because of my background, I was part of the global management team for procurement in PwC, and we were doing this yearly assessment. Everybody does it. Every big four and all the other guys are doing these procurement surveys. And there's one thing that comes out on top every year. And we were asking both procurement and finance. I think that's important, not just procurement. And number one hitter on priority is always cost reduction. So I agree that they should be better at this, but I think there's also maybe some realism in saying that procurement is put here to reduce the cost, at least per unit or per service or whatever it is, to make sure we keep on improving. We also improve the cash flow. But kind of like building the team, I think you need a different procurement department if you are in a scale-up, for instance, where your biggest concern is getting access to goods, raw materials, whatever you need to actually scale your organization. Versus, a big organization, which may hopefully still grow, or you have the foundation where you can still grow within the means and the boundaries already set by the previous teams, and your focus is on how do I cost optimize that one. So it really depends on the organization. I say for smaller mid-sized companies, you need different profile versus the ones you would have in the big organizations. They would not fit. The big organizations are more of cost administrations, market administrators, than they are in mid-sized small organizations, where they really have to be a lot more creative. Right? They have limited resources and requirements will change, and hopefully that organization is growing fast.
And what are the things that we should consider? Because sometimes cutting costs can be at the detriment of other things that are of importance to the organization. Maybe it's risk profiles, maybe it's relationships, all those kinds of things. So what are some of the things that we need to consider within procurement to make sure that KPIs need to be more well-rounded than just focused on cost? Is there elements that we need how we need to structure at least?
I think you're definitely right in your point. So the issue is that procurement should, of course, look at cost. It should look at supplier markets, how to nurse them, manage them, make sure that we have alternatives out there. There's a whole plethora of sanctions, risk exposures that we need to look at. But if we only measure procurement based on cost, then they'll do cost. Right. So And I have yet to see any organization have really good KPIs for non-cost, measures, because cost is also very data driven. So you can kind of pull it out of the dashboard, you can make a trend line, make it look fancy, change the colors, and even automate the reporting, right? Doesn't really happen within sanctions exposure or general risk exposure, which is much more of a, not soft, but you tend to have a lot of people involved in assessing, for instance, the risk of working with a specific supplier or going down a specific route within finance than you do when you're just measuring baseline versus current performance within finance, right? So it's easier to measure the cost. And I think that's also why it's a fallback. So I think it's a mutual detriment for finance procurement that all they really tend to measure is KPIs on cost. And then they say all the other stuff, but at the end of the day, after about a year and they come to the performance appraisals, they will look at the cost picture. No, you said 100, we got 90, so you failed. So yeah, okay, but I managed all these costs and all these exposures, and they're like, yeah, fine, but you're missing 10, right? So you get a D minus. So we need to be smarter.
Yeah, and you obviously said that you haven't really seen any good ways of measuring that, but how, when you were consulting, how would you assess that side of things in a procurement organization?
Well, I'm totally biased because I actually set up the first sustainable procurement project. It was a project, and smarter people than me made it then work later in their life, of course, for Maersk. But we were basically trying to say, okay, so exposures, for instance, on the ESG agenda, and risk exposures also. We also have financial exposure on these suppliers. We'll start measuring it, and we try to build that into our KPI scorecards to say, okay, so we used to have this exposure on these critical suppliers. We took a sub-component, of course, not all these many, many thousand suppliers you have in even in mid-sized companies, but take a section of it saying these ones we want to monitor. We want to be sure we reduce our risk, either of supply market access, the actual suppliers themselves, performance of the suppliers, or in this case also sustainability exposure, right? But you need to set up measurements for it. But for that to work, we also have to slice the cake just a bit, because we can't do this across every single supplier, every single category. That's just way too much. So it can be done, but it needs to be a firm dialogue between finance and procurement saying, okay, we have cost, that's fine. What else can we actually measure? Because we have to be honest that though procurement is not a finance function, even though it kind of looks and smells like one, we tend to believe in data. So if we make KPIs that are not really tangible, we don't really trust them. Like none of us, neither finance nor procurement, trust them at the end of the day. So it needs to be relatively hardcore. You can do that, the one we did about sustainability, that was limited external sources back then. It's about 15 years ago. Now you have a plethora of external sources where you can get ratings, risk exposures. You can hook up to external sources that automatically will update your own dashboards. So you can actually do a lot of this, but it has to be built, of course. Right? But I think we owe it to ourselves to start venturing into that and then be very concrete. So if we say we want to minimize risk exposure, then let's have a discussion about what kind of risk do we think we have exposure for? How do we measure it? How do we rate it? And then how do we report on it? Because if we don't report on it, we only report on cost, then it doesn't matter. Then you're back to cost.
So what you're saying there is understand the critical suppliers within your supply chain, assess their risk individually on multiple axes, and then use that to define and measure the improvement.
Exactly. So one of the last projects I did was we did a sanctions exposure for a big medical manufacturer in Europe. And we basically said, okay, so out of all these suppliers, they had a whole range of suppliers. We definitely knew the ones that had goods that were super critical for their strategy. Not always the biggest suppliers, by the way, but they definitely needed those. And we set up first manual and then automatic monitoring for sanctions exposure and, PEP tests and that kind of stuff. And then we baked that into the procurement KPIs. Because at least for those, we can get started. And then next year, they can add another 50 if they feel like it. But the critical ones actually had a pulse. Also, when we start to add more complex non-cost-based KPIs, we have to get both finance, procurement, and everybody else to get used to them first. So we cannot move from cost and then suddenly add 15 other fancy KPIs, even if we can measure them, because people will not be ready for them. Right? It's one step at a time.
And I really like your suggestion of working through the process of coming up with those KPIs as a team. So, we know this could be an issue. We need to assess this risk together. How are we going to measure it and how are we going to monitor? rather than sort of presenting people with the end result.
Yes. Oh, that never works, right? And also just be very pragmatic. I mean, I would much rather have a crude but tangible, assessment of, for instance, a risk exposure on a supplier or category than having nothing. Right? So I think it's also a matter of getting started and then saying, okay, this is like our alpha version. We can do a beta version next year, and then maybe we actually have an MVP in 3 years. But at least we got the ball rolling. Don't go from a 0 to 100. Even if consultants are saying you should do that, just don't do it. It's not going to work.
And obviously, we're talking about non-cost-based KPIs. What other KPIs do you think that procurement should consider as part of their non-cost KPIs?
Well, I think the whole Ukraine crisis have taught us that having access to alternative suppliers, the whole supply market access as a general thing, it has to be a KPI. Even if you don't use them, you probably should activate your secondary supply just a bit to make sure you have a relationship with them in case you need them. But I think the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine right now came, unfortunately, as a surprise, especially for the Ukrainians, of course, but also for the ones having Ukraine as a key source pool for goods, materials, and services. And most had no backup plans. None at all. So that's an easy example. It should be measured, especially on the critical items. And again, that's another point, is that a critical item doesn't have to be a high cost item. If it's critical for, supporting the strategic direction of the company, that is then de facto critical. It doesn't matter if it's minor investments or bigger investments, but it's critical, it's just de facto critical. And we need secondary sources for those, right? We need to monitor them very, very closely. We often see that then people, on paper, based on a crisis like the one we have right now, they will go together, they will find secondary suppliers, and then for the first year, they will actually activate those suppliers, and they'll make these really long, standard operating procedures for what happens. And then they're going to put them in a shelf somewhere, and they're never going to look at it. And then somebody rotates a job, and it's not kept alive. And by the way, you forgot to tell the supplier about this. And then somebody comes and says, "Oh, we should clean up the supplier base. Let's go back to one supplier, not two suppliers." And here we go, right? So it needs to be part of the day-to-day operations, which is often not the case. I think production companies are slightly better at this because they need to monitor it, but services, that's board, not so much.
And obviously you mentioned multiple suppliers and your exposure there. What other KPIs? What about things like quality? Is that something that you would measure and have KPIs in place for as well?
Yeah, so you have the rest of all the entire supply chain. You have delivery times, scheduling times. You got quality measures for all this, error rates. You also have things like refurbishment, return rates for all the stuff that's big and complicated enough to actually be received and then sent back to suppliers for refurbishment. There's a whole range you can build up about some of these, right? And they should have these KPIs. It's just some of these do not fit with finance at all. Then it's because you want to hook up. So if we had an advisory saying we want to hook up procurement with production, we would want to be sure we have those, which is much more about inbound flow, stock level units we have in there instead, quality of what we received, how many returns, how many errors do we have, backflow orders, that kind of stuff. We'd definitely measure that instead. But for finance, it's a bit more narrow, I think. Still have to be more than cost, though.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, and I'm guessing that depending on the organization type, the non-cost KPIs would vary, or should they all have a certain set of non-cost KPIs?
I think they should always have a certain set of non-cost. I think we always need to have at least some sort of measures on, for instance, things like compliance, which is close to cost, but it's not actually a cost measure, right? At least compliance to the contracts you made. We definitely need some sort of risk monitoring always. What kind of exposure do we have with these? This is very easy to automate, especially for the bigger ones. If it's production companies, lead time is a must-have, right? If you don't have lead times and actually delivery times on that one, you're dead in the water. So there's some of these that you always know for these organizations you can have. For service organizations, you don't need lead times, but you can definitely keep the rest. You always want to monitor your suppliers for exposures anyway.
Amazing. And we have rapidly run out of time. It's been a really interesting conversation, Thomas. But just wrap us up. Tell us what your top tips are for a high-performing procurement department.
Yeah, so I think first of all, they need to be closely aligned with finance because finance has the mandate, right? Procurement doesn't. They borrow the mandate from finance, right? The KPIs between them have to be the same. And then it depends on the maturity of the procurement department, of course. If it's very new, get somebody in there who's more of an entrepreneurial builder type, right? Lots of energy. May not be always totally socially adapt, but they will get things done and we'll get some quick results. If it's a more stable organization, make sure we have somebody who understands strategy, right? I think we always tend to make the mistake of having procurement staff with traditional procurement people, but whoever is heading it needs to understand that we do this to support the business. So be very careful about who the key employees are, and then they'll make sure you go in the right direction.
Amazing. So that's a great summary, to be fair, Thomas. And I think it's opened up more questions, but I won't take up any more of your time. And I want to say a massive thank you to you for coming on the podcast. But if somebody's listening to this and going, actually, I could do with some help or I could do with some advice, tell us a little bit about the services and the help that you offer.
Oh, absolutely. So what we have is basically a B2B SaaS company, and we work specifically within the spend analytics sphere. So it's just a matter of reaching out to us. Our specialty is trying to make procurement and finance actually be aligned on the numbers. We feel very much about this, I have to say. It has to be, one size fits all. Right? We really should be discussing numbers. So I'll just reach out, go to our homepage, and then see if I can get a hold of us. And what we also do is that we also support from advisory side in case there's need for this, but that's just part of the service because the more we share, the better it goes for our clients and the happier we are.
Amazing. And for anyone that would like to know more or find out, we will pop the links in the show notes so you can find them nice and easily. So I want to say thank you, Thomas, for joining me on the show today. And thank you to our audience for listening. And if you have enjoyed this podcast, perhaps you've got some burning questions I should have asked Thomas, then please do reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. Send me a message, send me a DM, and let me know what I should ask next time. And thank you again, Thomas. It's been fabulous having you on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.